Okay, good morning everyone. I'm Ben Watts from Cofely. I should take you through who Cofely are. I'll take you through a bit of context around district heating in the UK at the moment, some of the key factors, some of the key success factors. I've got a few examples of projects that have been delivered in partnership with the public sector, between the public and private sector, and then a few thoughts on the future direction of district energy in the UK. So very quickly, we're part of a very big organisation that you may never have heard of. GDF Suez is a global energy utility. There is no retail energy business in the UK, which is why most of you probably never heard of us. We have, I think GDF Suez has 16 businesses in the UK at the moment. There's oil and gas exploration, there's energy retail, there's water businesses. Cofely, which is the part of the organisation that I sit in, is the energy services business, and that's where our district heating expertise is. Cofely in the UK then is still a large organisation. There's about 15,000 of us, and we're separated into 4 distinct business lines, one of which is energy services, which again is where I sit in, but the rest of the business is about facilities management, asset management, and around business process outsourcing essentially. So within the energy services business, we do a lot of energy efficiency work for the public sector, industrial, commercial energy efficiency. We have district energy expertise, and it's that which I'm going to focus on today. So in the UK at the moment, you might be surprised to learn that there is a fair bit of district heating already in the UK. A lot of discussion over the last few years about how to create a market. To some extent, there are a large number of projects. A lot of these projects are fairly small, and in fact, the majority of heat which is supplied from district energy is probably supplied from 10 schemes in the UK. There are large schemes in cities like Nottingham, in Sheffield, in Southampton, which I'll come on to a couple of those shortly. The pie charts, if you can read it, suggest that most of that heat comes from natural gas at the moment, with about a quarter coming from energy from waste, heat recovered from energy from waste plants at the moment. And there's a huge opportunity for expanding for more of that. So larger networks in the UK, I've mentioned a couple of those already, Nottingham, Sheffield, Southampton is there, Birmingham there's a large network, Glasgow, Aberdeen, there is a network in Aberdeen if you may already be aware of, Lerwick in the Shetland Islands, which is of course not to the east of Aberdeen, but so what creates the likelihood of a successful district energy scheme? Rebecca's already mentioned about the heat mapping activity and identifying areas where it's likely to be a good option. Energy density is in some ways it's obvious, but it is absolutely key to these schemes. You need to find areas where there's a number of buildings in close proximity which together have a decent energy density. Diversity is massively important. If all of those buildings are operating at the same time in the same pattern with the same profile, it's unlikely that it will be possible to introduce really low carbon generation. So these schemes work best if there's a flat continuous base load, and the way that we achieve that is by connecting buildings together with different operating profiles. So hospitals, universities, council buildings, residential properties, offices, etc. And scale is helpful. It's not always essential. There are examples of fairly small scale schemes in the UK which would be classed as district heating, but which connect together a leisure centre, some civic buildings, and maybe a small number of buildings. They are connected via some pipe work, and there's a balancing of load which enables a scheme to start. And in some ways, it's that core scheme which is really critical to the wider rollout of district energy. It's important to get something built initially with these projects. Low cost of heat production is really helpful because it helps to improve the economics and fund some of the high capital costs of these networks. And low carbon heat sources increasingly is important. The whole strategy around district heating in the UK is about getting infrastructure in the ground now, getting some low carbon heat into that infrastructure now, but then over the next 20 or 30 years decreasing the carbon intensity of heat, and that's about renewable heat, it's about waste heat and industrial heat, secondary heat as it's generally referred to. So with that context, I'll talk about a few examples of schemes which all have slightly different characteristics, slightly different models. So hopefully that will tease out some of the key issues, I suppose. So in Southampton, there's a scheme which was originally started in the late 1980s. The scheme in Southampton is there because the Department for Energy at the time drilled a geothermal borehole, which still exists. In fact, we're in the process of installing a new pump in the geothermal well this year. The well provides about 2 megawatts of heat For those of you that doesn't mean anything, that's a large building. So the Civic Centre in Southampton has a peak demand on a cold day of about 2 megawatts. So it's not a big enough resource to supply an entire city. Department for Energy sort of parked it as an idea for Southampton, but the City Council adopted the well and decided to try and make something of it, which they've done subsequently. And over the last 28 years, I think, the scheme has expanded massively from the core beginnings of civic buildings and public buildings to now connecting lots of private and commercial buildings, including a large shopping centre, which you can see there, the Westquay Shopping Centre. There's around 9 megawatts of combined heat and power generation, as well as the geothermal well in Southampton. And I suppose one of the important points here is that this scheme is continuing to expand and continuing to grow. So only last year, large student accommodation block, 1,000 student bedroom block was connected to this scheme. And that enables more investment in low carbon plant and technology for these sorts of schemes. So this is, I suppose, an example of a mature scheme. It's a scheme that started very much around the public buildings, but which has grown and expanded to supply most of the centre of Southampton. And that's an example that can be replicated all over the country, no doubt. Leicester, the district energy scheme in Leicester is a public-private partnership between ourselves, Cofely, and Leicester City Council and the University of Leicester. So one of the important points about these schemes is bringing together sufficient load and sufficient number of buildings with sufficient density to enable investment to come in and get something built to start with. And the scheme in Leicester is an example of that. There is a joint cooperation agreement between ourselves and the council. Cofely put in all of the funding, so there's about £15 million worth of investment gone into the network. This is a massive undertaking in the centre of an existing city, not on a greenfield site. This is going into existing highway and connecting buildings which are otherwise have their own central boiler plant. There's around 3,000 homes connected to the scheme in Leicester. Those were originally supplied by smaller block heating systems, and the project enabled them to be joined together and the installation of large-scale CHP, which wouldn't have been possible at a block level. So there's actually 3 energy centres on the Leicester scheme which supply low-carbon heat to all of those buildings. Most of that CHP plant is actually located on the university campus, where they have a big electrical demand, but they don't have such a large heat demand. So the combination of the university with the power demand and the residential properties with the heat demand enables the correct mix and diversity of use. Here are some of the typical buildings you can see. They're not in themselves, they're not huge buildings, but in sufficient number and in sufficient density, they enable a scheme to get started. You won't be able to see the detail here, but I suppose the point of putting up the map is to say that the darker blue buildings are those that have already been connected to the network, and the green buildings are the residential areas. So these are fairly large council housing estates, have been connected together with the university, which is at the bottom of the map, the large blue area at the bottom of the map, and a large number of public buildings in the city centre. The lighter blue buildings are those where there's the opportunity then to expand and connect those buildings on. So this scheme is about 3 years old now, and that core scheme has been built. The core carbon savings are being delivered, all of the plant's been installed, and it's now a case of moving more into that Southampton type model where there's expansion and supply to third parties and to the private sector. In doing so, there'll be a shared benefit between the private sector and the council through a profit share mechanism. So, Birmingham's another example of a scheme that's been delivered in partnership with the public sector. So Birmingham City Council were very forward-thinking. About 10 years ago, actually started to look at this from a serious feasibility and business case perspective. And now 3 schemes have been developed in Birmingham, which were originally independently built. So there's one around the city centre and the Broad Street area, which is where the central business district is, Paradise Circus, the town hall, if any of you know Birmingham. And then there's separate schemes on a hospital campus and also at the Aston University campus. The redevelopment of New Street Station in the centre of Birmingham has enabled these schemes to be connected together. In fact, if we have a look on the next slide, so you can see the red blobs either side of the map here are the existing schemes. So the one on Broad Street, which supplies the large public buildings, the town hall, the council house, etc. On an Aston University on the other side.
and the redevelopment of Birmingham New Street Station enabled a large new generation plant to be installed at the station, which we're doing currently, and the interconnection, if you like, between these two existing schemes. So large power plant being built on New Street Station to supply power to the station. Again, not a big heat demand at the railway station itself, but in generating the power, they're producing waste heat, which can be used in the network, which can be supplied to the buildings that are already there. So that opens up a huge new corridor of opportunity for growth and expansion of this network in the future. And that's a project which is underway at the moment. It emphasises seeing the installation work taking place in New Street itself at the moment emphasises to me the difficulty in installing these networks in city centres. It's always going to be a challenge, but the size of the trenches in order to get under other services are, it's a major undertaking, and for an industry which isn't particularly well supported in terms of its rights as we're not statutory utilities in the way that gas and water networks are. We don't have the same rights, we don't have the same controls, we don't have the same abilities to go into the highway. Everything is very much more difficult. So those are some of the things I think that will need addressing going forward in the future in terms of regulation and the ability to get these networks built. There's some shots of the new station. The Olympic Park scheme is another example. I think that this is an interesting procurement solution here. In fact, this is a 40-year concession that was procured jointly by the Olympic Delivery Authority and Westfield as a private developer on the same site, on the adjacent site. In fact, the plan here shows the proximity. So when the Games was awarded to London, Westfield were already on site, and the ODA timeline, the Olympic Delivery Authority timeline, more or less matched that of Westfield and what they were planning to do in terms of the shopping centre and the mixed-use development next door. So they jointly procured all the services, and because they were they owned all of that land, they were able to provide a concession, which effectively means that anything that's built on that site has to connect into the district energy scheme, and in this case it's district heating and cooling scheme. And that certainty, that sort of regulated monopoly, I suppose, enabled a huge amount of investment to come in from over £100 million investment came in from Cofely for this project. It's, as I say, it's a very long-term contract, but it does secure low carbon energy to the future development on that site, and it is very tightly regulated in terms of the quality of service and price control and all of those sorts of things. There's a massive opportunity here for expansion outside of this concession area, and there's already buildings that have been connected beyond the boundary of that concession area, sort of using the benefit, I suppose, of the assets that have been built on the Olympic Park to supply housing and other developments in this area. One more example, which I'm very proud of as having been involved in this scheme, because this is a genuinely low carbon, a renewable scheme. Essentially, this is taking waste heat from an energy from waste plant a mile outside of Coventry city centre. It's owned by the Coventry and Solihull Waste Disposal Company, so it's in public control, and the council went out and tendered for someone to take heat from that facility and to install a network to enable it to be moved into the city centre and used to supply public buildings initially. So here we've got the council buildings, we've got leisure centres, we've got museums, we've got the council offices themselves, and also the cathedral in Coventry is also supplied from the network. And again, as regeneration areas start to emerge on the fringes and in the centre of Coventry, that scheme, that low carbon scheme, can easily be expanded to meet very challenging building regulations and achieve very high quality buildings without having to do things within the buildings and on the fabric, and smaller scale, less efficient, more costly renewable projects on site. We're able to pipe zero carbon heat practically to buildings in Coventry city centre. So that's essentially a tolling arrangement where we buy low carbon heat from the energy from waste plant, and we're shipping that and supplying it into the city centre. So I think energy from waste and schemes that are based around an energy from waste model are massively important going forward, and again we see some regulation and policy that would help to encourage that.
And so the final thought for me is about the future direction of those and other schemes. Some of the sort of key reasons that those schemes have got off the ground were around the fact that the public sector was able to commit a certain number of buildings to a scheme to get the whole thing started. So a core scheme, if you like, with the potential to expand and with the infrastructure built for expansion, but a core scheme all the same to get something done to start with. Initially with low carbon heat, so typically from gas-fired CHP, but there are examples there with waste heat and also from geothermal, as I've mentioned, and biomass on the Olympic Park, for example. There's then this expansion phase, which is where we've got to in Southampton, and some of the other schemes are starting to do that. And then there's definitely a need for innovation, and that will need to start soon. Principally, I mean, there could be all sorts of innovation with these schemes around storage and data and demand management and all of those things. But the thing I've mentioned here is around operating temperature. It's a slightly techie point, but it's necessary in order to get the maximum efficiency out of all of these systems. So if we're talking about solar thermal heat, or if we're talking about biomass, or if we're talking about heat pumps or waste heat from industry at very low temperature, it's essential to get the operating temperature of these distribution networks right down. That will involve changing plant and equipment in building services within the buildings themselves, which will need to happen and transition over time to enable zero carbon district heating to really to be achieving what everyone believes and needs to happen over the next few decades. So that's it for me. Thank you very much.